Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the extra mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now your hosts, Jackson Mummy and Megan Saya from Celebration Bar Review.
Hi, everybody. We are recording the day after the election, so I suppose we should call this episode Sleepless in Celebration and Southern California. Hi, Megan. How are you?
Hi, doing pretty well. How are you?
Good. You get any sleep last night?
I did. It helps that California, we're 3 hours behind.
Oh.
So the results start rolling in pretty early for us before dinner time from the East Coast states. So it's nice. You get to stay up pretty late in terms of the results and yet still get to bed at a decent hour. So
Yeah. And obviously we're not here to talk about national politics. We're talking about the bar exam, but the bar exam is in some ways inextricably linked to what's going on, certainly with COVID and the way that the bar examiners in different jurisdictions are dealing with that. And so in today's episode, you and I thought what we would do is to just talk through some of the developments in the bar exam world over the last week or so that you might have missed in all of the noise around the election and all the things that were going on there. So maybe a little shorter episode than usual, but we wanted to just catch everybody up on that. So I guess the place to start would be to just talk about the decision that the National Conference made about 10 days ago or so, and what the implications have been based on that decision.
yeah, so the NCBE has hopefully tried to sidestep some of the chaos and uncertainty of the last exam round and has said outright, we are going to give a full-length online option to states of the UBE. That also means that for states like California, who just use the MBE questions, they get to use those online. Obviously, states that do the full UBE, they will have the MEE questions, the MPT, and the MBE. So that's great news. I think now it's up to each jurisdiction to decide whether or not they plan on giving the in-person exam or the online exam. Either way, it's going to be at the normal date, which is really exciting for those of us in the bar review world and the bar taking world. I'm sure to just have that nailed down, that we know we're not going to have the chaos of this last cycle that just lasted for months and months, and there was so much uncertainty.
So we're looking at the last Tuesday and Wednesday of February 2021 as our bar exam dates, and the NCBE has said they will do the exam in two forms. They'll give the traditional in-person test, and they'll make it online. So there's no more plan B. There's no cut down version of the bar exam that's online. It is the full test. Now, given that, the next obvious question was, well, will jurisdictions, do they have the choice or can they offer both? And the answer was they can't offer both, at least outside of accommodations. In other words, no state, as far as we know, has said, we're going to do it both ways and you can pick and choose what you want to do. So where we stand now is California announced ahead of the NCBE that they were going to go online with or without them. So we think that's what probably prompted that decision as quickly as it came from the national conference. But then a group of states followed. So do you want to just run down that list of states that now say they are going to give the exam in February in an online format?
Yeah, we've got California, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Connecticut, DC, New Hampshire, Tennessee. And forgive me if more pop on by the time this goes live and you're listening to it, but as of right now, that's where we stand.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say, those are the states that were most aggressive going into October as well.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't think there were a bunch of surprises in that batch. We're going to see there's definitely a handful of states that I'm anticipating will probably end up going online, but they haven't said so yet. We'll see what happens. We'll keep people updated, but certainly keep an eye out for your jurisdiction. Again, same date. So there's no change, unlike last time where the online exam was given at a significantly later date. There's no date change. It's just a matter of whether in that jurisdiction you're going to be taking it on your own laptop at home, or you're going to be going into a testing center or convention center, hotel, etc., to take it.
Yeah, and we would expect that jurisdictions will make accommodations for those who cannot take it online, but I think you're going to have to prove an accommodation, a disability of some kind, in order to get those accommodations. So I want to be clear because we've gotten that question already from people saying, well, am I going to be able to choose? I'm in New York and I don't want to take it online. But that's not going to be a choice. That is how the test is going to be given. I also got some questions from foreign attorneys saying, can you take the exam from another country? And the answer to that, of course, is yes, provided that your equipment works and that you understand that the time change is, you're going to be taking the test in the middle of the night in some cases. But yes, you can do the test without coming to the US if you're in one of those online jurisdictions. So we're getting a lot of questions about Florida and Georgia, among some other states. And these were states that went online, obviously, in October of 2020. Will they continue to be online exams? Do we have any information about that yet?
Yeah, not yet. We know Florida's track record is certainly that they don't tend to be one of the first states to make decisions. So no surprise there. I think that they haven't said either way. Just note that for all the states, no answer doesn't mean that they're sticking with the in-person format. They may end up going that way, but as of right now, it may be just that they're still trying to make the decision. So until you hear otherwise, just know that it's in limbo and it could go either way until a state comes down on one side or the other.
Right. And then the final question that's come up that I'm hearing is, will there be open book exams? None of these states, to be clear, have indicated they're going to go to an open book or an email exam, correct?
Correct. And I think there are some questions about whether you'd be able to use the NCBE's exam in an open book format. That's a different kind of a situation. Obviously, the states that did open book in this last exam were not using NCBE materials for those portions that were open book. So that's an important point, is if it's using NCBE materials, my assumption would be that open book will not be an option.
Yeah, and just to make the shameless plug here, we do have a free training webinar called Now is the Best Time to Take the Bar Exam. And in that webinar, we do talk about the current status of all the states and what's happening with their particular exams and what we anticipate in terms of online, open book, email exams, and so on. So you can register for that. It's, the button is in your show notes, or it's right here on the video. So make sure you check that out as well. Okay, so that's what we've got from the national conference and from the states. I would expect we'll see more and more states making decisions, certainly as they release results from the July, September, October 2020 exam dates. And of course, that's still rolling. We'll talk about exam results in just a few minutes. Obviously, one of the big states that we're getting a lot of questions about, and it's made a lot of changes in New York. You want to catch us up on what New York has announced at this point?
Yeah, so New York has said that they are going to be doing an online exam. And like last time, they are significantly restricting who is going to be eligible to register for the exam. So just like last time, they're doing multiple waves of enrollment periods. And so you need to figure out if you fall under the categories that are currently enrolling for the exam. And if not, they're not telling us, oh, here's what's coming up next. We just have to wait and see if you fall under the next category. So as of right now, they're in the first application filing period. This is until the 15th of this month. So it's going to be a little while longer. But there are two requirements. So, or two major requirements, they're saying, with multiple sub requirements.
Yeah.
Okay. So in true lawyer fashion, this is a very complex tree of who is allowed to take the exam. So first time JD candidates who graduated from an ABA approved law school in 2020 or will graduate in January or February of 2021, or who are eligible as pro bono scholars, and who did not take any bar exam in any format in any state during 2020. So what that means is that second part is for right now, if you've taken, so we'll get to you in a second if you're in October, but let's put that aside for right now. If you've taken a bar exam in 2020, no good. If you are not a first time taker, no good. If you are not a JD, no good. Okay. If you didn't go to ABA accredited law school and graduate in 2020 or are graduating in January or February of 2021, no good. So that's the first group of people who are allowed to apply right now. The second group is JD candidates who graduated from an ABA approved law school in the US between 2016 and 2020 and sat for at least one prior bar exam in New York between July 2016 and February 2020. So that would be if you are a graduate from the last 4 years and you sat for a bar in New York. No good if you graduated in 2017, sat in New Jersey and failed and want to come in and try New York. Also no good if you, presumably, if you sat in New Jersey, passed, and now want to come in to New York. That, I think, to me is one of the most surprising things about this is there's no room really for people who are currently licensed in another state who are moving to New York, who want to practice in New York. But that being said, if you graduated from law school before 2016, as of right now, there's no room for you to apply to take the exam. Let
me clarify one thing here, because it's kind of odd and a little different than what they did in 2020. You could theoretically, as I read this instruction, you could have taken the bar exam every exam, so twice a year between 2016 and 2020, failed it every time, and presuming that you graduated law school in 2016 or later, you would be eligible. Now, in 2020, they didn't allow that. So there is some window there for repeat takers that didn't exist before. It's a very weird grouping, and it's a very strange, why would you take this group all of a sudden and say, sure, but only if you've taken at least one exam in New York. So they're clearly trying to keep out the people that have been sitting in other UBE jurisdictions, right? Is that your take on it as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's reciprocity things with other UBE jurisdictions. So, you're okay, presumably, if you had passed within the timeframes that are required in another UBE jurisdiction and you want to waive into New York, that's a whole other question. But let's say California. Let's say you're from California and you pass the California bar and now you are moving to New York and you need to be able to get licensed to practice there. As of right now, I don't see a path forward for that.
No, I don't think there would be. I don't think there's any way to do that. So I think now, instead of keeping out repeaters, and certainly if you graduated in 2015 or earlier, regardless of how many times you're taking the exam, you're just not eligible. But that scenario you've given of a California attorney, no, they wouldn't be allowed to sit in New York, which is bizarre to say the least. And we'll talk about reciprocity in a minute because they've got some weird rules there and transfers on their scores. But okay, so, and I will caveat all of this. This is the information the examiners have produced. We are repeating it for you, but we are not advising you, and you need to figure this out and decide on your own. So this is informational and not in the form of legal representation. All right, so that's my required disclaimer. So that's in our first wave in New York. Then after that, the number of people who have applied, then they'll make a decision about a second wave potentially, but they haven't expressed or delineated who would be in that second wave, correct?
And the other thing that we do know, though, is that there's a special carve-out situation for candidates who took the October 2020 exam. So what's interesting is back before the October 2020 exam, New York had said in their FAQs, it said, if I fail the October remote exam, will I be permitted to apply for the February 2021 examination? Yes, applicants who are not successful on the October 2020 remote exam will be permitted to apply for the February 2021 examination. And they were going to have a shorter filing period. Right. So once the results had been released. So basically that's why you don't see an opening in this wave for those students, because it's going to be a different application period. They need to make sure that they have the results out first, and for sure whether you passed or failed before they open that. What's interesting, though, is that this FAQ, as of right now, contradicts what they are saying currently about LLMs. So LLMs were eligible to take the October 2020 exam. And under that FAQ, there is nothing saying only JD candidates are going to be able to sit for the February 2021. However, under this release that the New York bar examiners sent out, it says, notice to candidates who took the October 2020 remote exam, they say you will be eligible to apply for the February 2021 exam only if you took the New York remote exam and are Juris Doctor candidates.
Yeah.
So this is a big question mark because it is a direct contradiction of what they told LLMs back in October. I don't know if it's intentional or if it was an oversight. So if you are an LLM candidate who took the October 2020 online exam in New York and you find out that you failed, you need to call New York and determine whether you're going to be allowed to sit for the February 2021 exam. It could be that when they wrote this, they just forgot about LLMs. Sorry, LLMs, but that happens a lot, I think. I find that it's kind of the short end of the stick many times. It could be that. It could be that they have a reverse position. We don't know. So it's something that I want to flag for you, that if you fall into that category, I mean, I wouldn't just say hope is lost and move on, but you are going to need to dig a little deeper and find out if they're going to let you sit for it. Of course, if they come out with anything, we'll keep you updated on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good catch. I had the same question, so we'll see what happens there. Then I suppose the last big piece of New York we want to talk about is who can transfer a score into New York, because it was unclear, that, and this is different than reciprocity. I mean, New York did set up reciprocity for the October exam with a few jurisdictions, but there is a question about, can you transfer a score earned on what they call the remote exam in a reciprocal jurisdiction? So if you sat in one of those jurisdictions, it was not automatic that you could get reciprocity into New York, even though New York could give you reciprocity out. So you want to talk a little bit about those requirements?
Yeah, so let me just go through the requirements. So there are 4 different types of candidates that are eligible to transfer a score earned on the remote exam in a reciprocal jurisdiction. So again, that's just for the reciprocal jurisdictions. All right, the first is any candidate who graduated from an ABA law school with a JD and has not ever sat for a bar exam in any US jurisdiction. Okay. Second is any foreign educated candidate, ABA law school graduate, but has an LLM and has not previously sat for the bar exam in any US jurisdiction. So basically same thing, but for LLMs. Then next is any candidate who graduated in 2018 with a JD from an ABA accredited law school who sat for one prior administration of the UBE, but has not sat for more than one bar exam in any US jurisdiction. Okay. And then finally is any candidate who graduated in 2019 or later with a JD from an ABA accredited law school who previously took the UBE and failed no more than 2 times. So that's a lot. I'm going to leave that to you all to figure out if that is you or not. But those are the 4 categories.
Right. And just in case you're wondering what the reciprocal jurisdictions were, because it all starts there. If you weren't from one of those reciprocal jurisdictions, none of what we just said applies. You're just not eligible to transfer in out of the October exam. But those jurisdictions were Connecticut, DC, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Ohio, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont. And you had to have a 266 score. So, and by the way, I don't think any of those states have yet released their results from the October 5th and 6th exam. So this is all preliminary.
Yes. Yep.
Some kind of fun, huh? Don't you love it? I mean, New York. So I think that the bottom line here is that it's going to get tougher and tougher to get into, take the New York exam. Foreign trained attorneys, I would strongly encourage you to look at other jurisdictions that you could sit in that would accept your educational credentials from outside the US, because New York, which has historically been one of the more open states, clearly seems to be closing their doors, at least for the time being. And did you notice and find it interesting that they talked about how the justification for all this was that they were worried that there'd be so many people wanting to take the exam, even though it's online, that it would be impossible for them to handle all of that activity. And therefore, that's why they were limiting the exam.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because eventually, unless you just keep the doors shut for so long that people give up, at some point, if you open the doors, you're going to have that flood that we've been talking about. With all the jurisdictions, this is a problem, right? That there are so many people were kept out are being pushed into the next exam pool. And yet those law students keep churning out. So there's no break in that way. And so to me, it seems like, gosh, wouldn't you rather reach that equilibrium again at an online test than reach that equilibrium again at an in-person exam? But what do I know?
Yeah, the board said that they were mindful of the challenges posed by a large potential pool of test takers for the first full remote UBE, that's the one they'll give in February, including the impact of a large number of test takers for the February 21 exam would have had on the board's ability to adequately prepare for the July 2021 exam. What? I'm sorry, I call BS on that. I just don't buy that at all. So there you go. That's what we know in New York. Lovely, lovely folks. And I think they are operating under the cover of darkness here to try and do something that obviously is part of some agenda to tamp down the number of applicants. And they're simply using the excuse of online and COVID, I think, as a way to do that. So it's my personal view. We'll see what happens. All right. That takes us through all of that. Where do we go next?
So I think we're getting a lot of questions from students. I'm sure this is pretty common across the board of, okay, if I'm in the UBE anyway, and it doesn't really matter where I take the exam, and then now with the reciprocity should be more like what we're used to seeing now that it's a full UBE exam, where should I take the test? Should I go online? If a jurisdiction is doing online, should I go to an in-person exam? Is there a difference, a benefit to sitting in the room versus doing it on my own? How should students make these kind of choices?
Yeah, we are getting a lot of those kinds of questions. We've talked about this. We talked about it a little bit in 2020, in fall of 2020, as people were having to make some decisions. I think the criteria is still very much the same. I think you start first with the health considerations. If it would be dangerous to your health to sit in an in-person exam, then I would certainly not take the bar exam in an in-person setting. You have the option now to do online. Secondly, in terms of the test itself, it will be the same test, and you will be in a jurisdiction where everyone's taking it online or where everyone's taking it in person. So you're going to be in a cohort, you're going to be scaled against that same group of people in terms of your written work for the UBE, so the essays and performance test. Your multi-state, however, will be compared to all multi-state takers across the United States, which means some people who took the exam in person and some people who took it online. Right now, because there hasn't been a full-length 200-question exam given online, we have no way of knowing if that's better or worse. But that's one of the realities. I think there are obvious advantages to taking a test online. You've talked about it a lot, Megan, the ability to sleep in your own bed, to have meals in your own kitchen, to not have to travel and deal with all of the difficulties that go with that, not to be in a room with other bar takers. And I think in general, I'd be curious what your reaction has been. The students that I've mentored seem to have been pretty positive about the online testing experience as compared to an in-person exam.
Yeah, I agree. People seem to have had really good experiences with the online on the whole. I will say the considerations that I would be thinking about if I were a student, and again, we can't advise anyone individually or specifically what to do, but in general, I would be looking at anybody who has released or will release their schedule. I would look at that because I think that's one of the downsides of the online test is the way that you have to break things up so that you're on screen for a certain amount of time and you cannot leave, and then you have a break, means that are you doing really long ones where you're going to have medical reasons that you maybe can't sit there for that long without getting up? Or is your day going to be really, really long because they have to put in all these breaks? Is it going to be a really difficult test to get through sort of endurance wise? That's one of the things that I would definitely be looking at if I were looking at the online. And then I think the other thing that I'm keeping an eye on, it's really new, is what are these pass rates of the in-person exams versus the online? We don't have a good sample size yet. We have a ton of the in-person exams results coming in. Those have been fantastic, just absolutely fantastic results. We only really have, is it Idaho, I believe, their online.
Yeah.
Their online results are back in. Now, part of it is because online in Idaho was a tiny, tiny amount of people. Okay.
28 people or something.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really small. So it's certainly not indicative of what's going to happen, but the results were abysmal. So I'm not taking that. I hesitate to say it because I don't want people to take that and then extrapolate, right? We just went through this last night with the polling, and this would be like saying we've got 1% of the vote in Wisconsin, so let's call Wisconsin. Like, of course not. We're going to wait and see what happens as we get more data. So we're waiting for that to see, but it's something that, to be honest, I would keep an eye on if I were trying to decide if I'm going to do an online exam versus an in-person, is I would probably look at the jurisdictions I was considering and see, well, was there a large difference in the pass rates for that jurisdiction's online exam and their in-person exam? And maybe if there's a large difference, it might factor into my decision.
Yeah, and I think the final piece to keep in mind is writing an essay and writing a performance test online is different than doing it in a hard copy and then typing it in your computer. And certainly if you're a handwriter, that's not an option online at all, though we would recommend you always type. But it is different to type a performance test that you only see on your screen versus having a physical set of documents in front of you. Now, our course has done, I think, a pretty good job of preparing students based on feedback for the performance tests online and the essay writing online. I think it's one of the reasons why you want to be in a course that thinks about online testing as compared to traditional preparation and then trying to figure out sort of their plan B about how to prepare people for it. But it is another consideration to keep in mind. Remember, however, if you're in a jurisdiction where it's online, everyone's handicapped the same way. So the performance test will have a scale that's relative for everyone that's the same, because that's only being scaled really in that jurisdiction. You're not competing against people that then did it in person. So something else to keep in mind. And these are tough decisions to make. I would say look at jurisdictions and just see where you're comfortable applying, what the application looks like, the costs, as you say, Megan, the schedules, and recognize that if you're in the UBE, you've got a lot of choices. You're going to have 30 plus different jurisdictions. The only one that's really restricted right now in the UBE is New York. I think just about every other jurisdiction is pretty much wide open, certainly if you've graduated from an ABA law school. And if you didn't go to an ABA accredited law school, if you're in California, you're going to take a Cal Bar. That's it. And that's not the UBE. So I think that's where we are. You mentioned pass rates. Let's just briefly touch on, we did get one, I think, new set of pass rates in the last couple of days. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so they have been coming in, but I try to just highlight the big ones because I think, like with the Idaho, it's hard to take much out of these smaller jurisdictions or places where very few people sat for the exam. But we did get Texas's second, I believe, in-person exam. Gosh, it's hard to keep track. Anyway, one of Texas's September in-person, I guess it was their first.
But the one in the hotel rooms, wasn't it? You went into your own hotel room and
yeah, I believe so. Forgive me if I'm wrong. There are so many different administrations of this test that I have to keep track of. So, but we did get the September 2020 exam from Texas. This was in person. And Texas, this was the last go round for Texas to give, so still the online test, but their last go round of this section of giving the Texas bar as opposed to moving over to the UBE. So very interesting to see these before they switch over. But I think really great numbers coming out of Texas. The overall pass rate was 76.66%, which is, I think, fantastic. There were over 1,000 people who took that particular exam. And what I really love, because we work with repeaters, so that's really where my eye always goes, their repeat pass rate was 42.13%, which I think is really good. And we've seen that with these 2020 exams, we are seeing great numbers for repeat bar takers. And that's been a really encouraging part of this.
I agree. And I think the reason we wanted to highlight Texas is the unique situation, which we're going to be able to measure the in-person exam on September 9th with the online test that they gave on October 5th. And because it's the same cohort of people, the test obviously looked different. There was a different number of essays. It was a lot of weirdness in Texas. But I'm going to be really curious to see what the pass rate is of the online Texas exam in October as compared to this in-person exam. It's one of the bigger jurisdictions where I think we're going to have enough data points to really be able to make some analysis about what it means. So we'll keep an eye on that. We're looking forward to those Texas results. But of course, most of the jurisdictions that tested in October will not be putting out results until late November, December, even January of 2021. So we'll keep you informed here on the podcast as those results come out. I think you can tell there's a lot that's been going on. While everyone was focused on national politics, there's been a lot happening with the bar exam. I wouldn't expect that to decrease at all over the next couple of weeks. Leading up to Thanksgiving, I think it's going to continue to be busy. Florida releases their results from their very odd October 13th exam. That comes out on November 20th. So we'll be watching for that. That'll be an interesting bellwether, I think, as well. Wild times, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, definitely. But there's a lot of good news that I'm seeing throughout this. So definitely keep that hope alive if you took the exam already. And certainly if you're a February student, I think you're in a pretty good position overall to be able to have some choices.
Yeah, and again, I just want to remind everybody that our free training webinar really digs in deep into why we think 2021 is the best time to take the bar exam. So if you're not yet decided about what to do, please join us for that. It's a 1-hour training. We wrap it up at the end with a live Q&A, and I think it'll be super helpful for you in trying to figure out what your options might be and where we go. But I agree with you, Megan. I am very optimistic about what we see. I think on the whole, things are going well. Our student feedback has been wonderful. And I think students in our course felt really, really prepared for their exams, wherever they took them and however they took them. So if you're thinking you got a lot of time to get ready for the February exam, not so. This is the time to get started for sure. All right, well, thanks for being with us. Hopefully the world will look clearer to us in a week, all the way around. And hopefully, at least here on the East Coast, we will have gotten some sleep. So thanks for being with us. Thank you for being with us, Megan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and watching the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at celebrationbarreview.com.